Chapter 33. Without the walled city, the slope of the years. The immediate result of this was nothing. Results from such things are usually long and growing. Morning brings a change of feeling. The existent condition invariably pleads for itself. It is only at odd moments we get glimpses of the misery of things. The heart understands when it is confronted with contrasts. Take them away, and the ache subsides. Carrie went on leading much the same life for 6 months thereafter or more. She did not see Ames any more. He called once upon the Vances, but she only heard about it through the young wife. Then he went west, and there was a gradual subsidence of whatever personal attraction had existed. The mental effect of the thing had not gone, however, and never would entirely. She had an ideal to contrast men by, particularly men close to her. During all this time, a period of rapidly approaching 3 years, Hurstwood had been moving along in an even path. There was no apparent slope downward, and distinctly none upward, so far as the casual observer might have seen. But psychologically there was a change which was marked enough to suggest the future very distinctly indeed. This was in the mere matter of the halt his career had received when he departed from Chicago. A man's fortune or material progress is very much the same as his bodily growth. Either he is growing stronger, healthier, wiser, as the youth approaching manhood, or he is growing weaker, older, less incisive mentally as the man approaching old age. There are no other states. Frequently there is a period between the cessation of youthful accretion and the setting in the case of the middle-aged man, of the tendency toward decay when the two processes are almost perfectly balanced, and there is little doing in either direction. Given time enough, however, the balance becomes a sagging to the graveside. Slowly at first, then with a modest momentum, and at last the graveward process is in the full swing. So it is frequently with man's fortune. If its process of accretion is never halted, if the balancing stage is never reached, there will be no toppling. Rich men are, frequently in these days, saved from this dissolution of their fortune by their ability to hire younger brains. These younger brains look upon the interests of the fortune as their own, and so steady and direct its progress. If each individual were left absolutely to the care of his own interests, and were given time enough in which to grow exceedingly old, his fortune would pass as his strength and will. He and his would be utterly dissolved and scattered unto the four winds of the heavens. But now see wherein the parallel changes. A fortune, like a man, is an organism which draws to itself other minds and other strength than that inherent in the founder. Beside the young minds drawn to it by salaries, it becomes allied with young forces, which make for its existence even when the strength and wisdom of the founder are fading. It may be involved in providing something for which there is a growing demand. This removes it at once beyond the special care of the founder. It needs not so much foresight now as direction. The man wanes, the need continues or grows, and the fortune, fallen into whose hands it may, continues. Hence some men never recognize the turning in the tide of their abilities. It is only in chance cases where a fortune or a state of success is wrested from them that the lack of ability to do so as they did formerly becomes apparent. Hurstwood, set down under new conditions, was in a position to see that he was no longer young. If he did not, it was due wholly to the fact that his state was so well balanced that an absolute change for the worse did not show. Not trained to reason or introspect himself, he could not analyze the change that was taking place in his mind, and hence his body, but he felt the depression of it. Constant comparison between his old state and his new showed a balance for the worse, which produced a constant state of gloom, or at least depression. Now it has been shown experimentally that a constantly subdued frame of mind produces certain poisons in the blood, called catastates, just as virtuous feelings of pleasure and delight produced helpful chemicals called anastates. The poisons generated by remorse inveigh against the system and eventually produce marked physical deterioration. To these, Hurstwood was subject. In the course of time, it told upon his temper. His eye no longer possessed that buoyant, searching shrewdness which had characterized it in Adam Street. His step was not as sharp and firm. He was given to thinking, thinking, thinking. The new friends he made were not celebrities. They were of a cheaper, a slightly more sensual and cruder grade. He could not possibly take the pleasure in this company that he had in that of those fine frequenters of the Chicago resort. He was left to brood. Slowly, exceedingly slowly, his desire to greet, conciliate, and make at home these people who visited the Warren Street place passed from him. More and more slowly, the significance of the realm he had left began to be clear. It did not seem so wonderful to be in it when he was in it. It had seemed very easy for anyone to get up there and have ample raiment and money to spend. But now that he was out of it, how far off it became. He began to see as one sees a city with a wall about it. Men were posted at the gates. You could not get in. Those inside did not care to come out to see who you were. They were so merry inside there that all those outside were forgotten, and he was on the outside. Each day he could read in the evening papers of the doings within the city. In the notices of passengers for Europe, he read the names of eminent frequenters of his old resort. In the theatrical column appeared, from time to time, announcements of the latest successes of men he had known. He knew that they were at their old gaieties. Pullmans were hauling them to and fro about the land. Papers were greeting them with interesting mentions. The elegant lobbies of hotels and the glow of polished dining rooms were keeping them close within the walled city. Men whom he had known, men whom he had tipped glasses with, rich men, and he was forgotten. Who was Mr. Wheeler? What was the Warren Street resort? Bah! If one thinks that such thoughts do not come to so common a type of mind, that such feelings require a higher mental development, I would argue for their consideration the fact that it is the higher mental development that does away with such thoughts. It is the higher mental development which induces philosophy and that fortitude which refuses to dwell upon such things, refuses to be made to suffer by their consideration. The common type of mind is exceedingly keen on all matters which relate to its physical welfare. Exceedingly keen. It is the unintellectual miser who sweats blood at the loss of $100. It is the Epictetus who smiles when the last vestige of physical welfare is removed. The time came in the third year when this thinking began to produce results in the Warren Street place. The tide of patronage dropped a little below what it had been at its best since he had been there. This irritated and worried him. There came a night when he confessed to Carrie that the business was not doing as well this month as it had the month before. This was in lieu of certain suggestions she had made concerning little things she wanted to buy. She had not failed to notice that he did not seem to consult her about buying clothes for himself. For the first time, it struck her as a ruse, or that he said it so that she would not think of asking for things. Her reply was mild enough, but her thoughts were rebellious. He was not looking after her at all. She was depending for her enjoyment upon the Vances. And now the latter announced that they were going away. It was approaching spring, and they were going north. "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Vance to Carrie, "we think we might as well give up the flat and store our things. We'll be gone for the summer, and it would be a useless expense. I think we'll settle a little farther downtown when we came back." Carrie heard this with genuine sorrow. She had enjoyed Mrs. Vance's companionship so much. There would be no one else in the house whom she knew. Again, she would be all alone. Hurstwood's gloom over the slight decrease in profits and the departure of the Vances came together. So Carrie had the loneliness and this mood of her husband to enjoy at the same time. It was a grievous thing. She became restless and dissatisfied, not exactly as she thought with Hurstwood, but with life. What was it? A very dull round indeed. What did she have? Nothing but this narrow little flat. The Vances could travel. They could do the things worth doing, and here she was. For what was she made, anyhow? More thought followed, and then tears. Tears seemed justified, and the only relief in the world. For another period, the state continued, the twain leading a rather monotonous life, and then there was a slight change for the worse. One evening, Hurstwood, after thinking about a way to modify Carrie's desire for clothes and the general strain upon his ability to provide, said, "I don't think I'll ever be able to do much with Shaughnessy." "What's the matter?" said Carrie. "Oh, he's a slow, greedy Mick. He won't agree to anything to improve the place, and it won't ever pay without it." "Can't you make him?" said Carrie. "No, I've tried. The only thing I can see if I want to improve is to get a hold of a place of my own." "Why don't you?" said Carrie. "Well, all I have is tied up in there just now. If I had a chance to save a while, I think I could open a place that would give us plenty of money." "Can't we save?" said Carrie. "We might try it," he suggested. "I've been thinking that if we'd take a smaller flat downtown and live economically for a year, I would have enough, with what I have invested, to open a good place. Then we could arrange to live as you want to." "It would suit me all right," said Carrie, who nevertheless felt badly to think it had come to this. Talk of a smaller flat sounded like poverty. "There are lots of nice little flats down around 6th Avenue below 14th Street. We might get one down there." "I'll look at them if you say so," said Carrie. "I think I could break away from this fellow inside of a year, said Hurstwood. "Nothing will ever come of this arrangement as it's going on now." "I'll look around," said Carrie, observing that the proposed change seemed to be a serious thing with him. The upshot of this was that the change was eventually effected, not without great gloom on the part of Carrie. It really affected her more seriously than anything that had yet happened. She began to look upon Hurstwood wholly as a man and not as a lover or husband. She felt thoroughly bound to him as a wife, and that her lot was cast with his, whatever it might be. But she began to see that he was gloomy and taciturn, not a young, strong, and buoyant man. He looked a little bit old to her, about the eyes and the mouth now. And there were other things which placed him in his true rank, so far as her estimation was concerned. She began to feel that she had made a mistake. Incidentally, she also began to recall the fact that he had practically urged her to flee with him. The new flat was located in 13th Street, a half-block west of 6th Avenue, and contained only 4 rooms. The new neighborhood did not appeal to Carrie as much. There were no trees here, no west view of the river. The street was solidly built up. There were 12 families here, respectable enough, but nothing like the Vances. Richer people required more space. Being left alone in this little place, Carrie did without a girl. She made it charming, though, but could not make it delight her. Hurstwood was not inwardly pleased to think that they should have to modify their state, but he argued that he could do nothing. He must put the best face on it and let it go at that. He tried to show Carrie that there was no cause for financial alarm, but only congratulation over the chance he would have at the end of the year by taking her rather more frequently to the theater and by providing a liberal table. This was for the time only. He was getting in the frame of mind where he wanted principally to be alone and to be allowed to think. The disease of brooding was beginning to claim him as a victim. Only the newspapers and his own thoughts were worthwhile. The delight of love had again slipped away. It was a case of live now, making the best you can out of a very commonplace station in life. The road downward has but few landings in level places. The very state of his mind, superinduced by his condition, caused the breach to widen between him and his partner. At last, that individual began to wish that Hurstwood was out of it. It so happened, however, that a real estate deal on the part of the owner of the land arranged things even more effectually than ill will could have schemed. "Did you see that?" said Shaughnessy one morning to Hurstwood, pointing to the real estate column in a copy of the Herald which he held. "No, what is it?" said Hurstwood, looking down the items of news. "The man who owns this ground has sold it." "You don't say so," said Hurstwood. He looked, and there was the notice. Mr. Auguste Viele had yesterday registered the transfer of the lot, 25 by 75 feet, at the corner of Warren and Hudson Streets to J.F. Slauson for the sum of $57,000. "Our lease expires when?" asked Hurstwood, thinking. "Next February, isn't it?" "That's right," said Shaughnessy. "It doesn't say what the new man's going to do with it," remarked Hurstwood, looking back to the paper. "We'll hear, I guess, soon enough," said Shaughnessy. Sure enough, it did develop. Mr. Slauson owned the property adjoining and was going to put up a modern office building. The present one was to be torn down. It would take probably a year and a half to complete the other one. All these things developed by degrees, and Hurstwood began to ponder over what would become of the saloon. One day he spoke about it to his partner. "Do you think it would be worthwhile to open up somewhere else in the neighborhood?" "What would be the use?" said Shaughnessy. "We couldn't get another corner around here." It wouldn't pay anywhere else, do you think?" "I wouldn't try it," said the other. The approaching change now took on a most serious aspect to Hurstwood. Dissolution meant the loss of his $1,000, and he could not save another 1,000 in the time. He understood that Shaughnessy was merely tired of the arrangement and would probably lease the new corner when completed alone. He began to worry about the necessity of a new connection and to see impending serious financial straits unless something turned up. This left him in no mood to enjoy his flat, or Carrie, and consequently the depression invaded that quarter. Meanwhile, he took such time as he could to look about, but opportunities were not numerous. More, he had not the same impressive personality which he had when he first came to New York. Bad thoughts had put a shade into his eyes which did not impress others favorably. Neither had he $1,300 in hand to talk with. About a month later, finding that he had not made any progress, Shaughnessy reported definitely that Slauson would not extend the lease. "I guess this thing's got to come to an end," he said, affecting an air of concern. "Well, if it has, it has," answered Hurstwood grimly. He would not give the other a key to his opinions, whatever they were. He should not have the satisfaction. A day or two later he saw that he must say something to Carrie. "You know," he said, "I think I'm going to get the worst of my deal down there." "How is that?" asked Carrie in astonishment. "Well, the man who owns the ground has sold it, and the new owner won't release it to us. The business may come to an end." "Can't you start somewhere else?" "There doesn't seem to be any place. Shaughnessy doesn't want to." "Do you lose what you put in?" "Yes," said Hurstwood, whose face was a study. Oh, isn't that too bad? Said Carrie. It's a trick, said Hurstwood, that's all. They'll start another place there, all right. Carrie looked at him and gathered from his whole demeanor what it meant. It was serious, very serious. Do you think you can get something else? She ventured timidly. Hurstwood thought a while. It was all up with the bluff about money and investment. She could see now that he was broke. I don't know, he said solemnly. I can try. Chapter 34. The grind of the millstones, a sample of chaff. Carrie pondered over this situation as consistently as Hurstwood once she got the facts adjusted in her mind. It took several days for her to fully realize that the approach of the dissolution of her husband's business meant commonplace struggle and privation. Her mind went back to her early venture in Chicago, the Hansons and their flat, and her heart revolted. That was terrible. Everything about poverty was terrible. She wished she knew a way out. Her recent experiences with the Vances had wholly unfitted her to view her own state with complacence. The glamour of the high life of the city had, in the few experiences afforded her by the former, seized her completely. She had been taught how to dress and where to go without having ample means to do either. Now, these things, ever-present realities as they were, filled her eyes and mind. The more circumscribed became her state, the more entrancing seemed this other. And now poverty threatened to seize her entirely and to remove this other world far upward like a heaven to which any Lazarus might extend appealingly his hands. So too the ideal brought into her life by Ames remained. He had gone, but here was his word that riches were not everything, that there was a great deal more in the world than she knew, that the stage was good and the literature she read poor. He was a strong man and clean. How much stronger and better than Hurstwood and Drouet she only half formulated to herself, but the difference was painful. It was something to which she voluntarily closed her eyes. During the last 3 months of the Warren Street connection, Hurstwood took parts of days off and hunted, tracking the business advertisements. It was a more or less depressing business, wholly because of the thought that he must soon get something or he would begin to live on the few $100s he was saving. And then he would have nothing to invest. He would have to hire out as a clerk. Everything he discovered in his line advertised as an opportunity was either too expensive or too wretched for him. Besides, winter was coming. The papers were announcing hardships, and there was a general feeling of hard times in the air, or at least he thought so. In his worry, other people's worries became apparent. No item about a firm failing, a family starving, or a man dying upon the streets supposedly of starvation, but arrested his eye as he scanned the morning papers. Once the World came out with a flaring announcement about 80,000 people out of employment in New York this winter, which struck as a knife at his heart. 80,000, he thought. What an awful thing that is. This was new reasoning for Hurstwood. In the old days, the world had seemed to be getting along well enough. He had been wont to see similar things in the daily news in Chicago, but they did not hold his attention. Now, these things were like gray clouds hovering along the horizon of a clear day. They threatened to cover and obscure his life with chilly grayness. He tried to shake them off, to forget and brace up. Sometimes, he said to himself mentally, what's the use worrying? I'm not out yet. I've got 6 weeks more. Even if worse comes to worse, I've got enough to live on for 6 months. Curiously, as he troubled over his future, his thoughts occasionally reverted to his wife and family. He had avoided such thoughts for the first 3 years as much as possible. He hated her, and he could get along without her. Let her go. He would do well enough. Now, however, when he was not doing well enough, he began to wonder what she was doing, how his children were getting along. He could see them living as nicely as ever, occupying the comfortable house and using his property. By George, it's a shame they should have it all, he vaguely thought to himself on several occasions. I didn't do anything. As he looked back now and analyzed the situation which led up to his taking the money, he began to mildly justify himself. What had what in the world that should bar him out this way and heap such difficulties upon him? It seemed only yesterday to him, since he was comfortable and well-to-do. But now it was all wrested from him. She didn't deserve what she got out of me, that is sure. I didn't do so much if everybody could just know. There was no thought that the facts ought to be advertised. It was only a mental justification he was seeking from himself, something that would enable him to bear his state as a righteous man. One afternoon, 5 weeks before the Warren Street place closed up, he left the saloon to visit 3 or 4 places he saw advertised in the Herald. One was down in Gold Street, and he visited that, but did not enter. It was such a cheap-looking place he felt that he could not abide it. Another was on the Bowery, which he knew contained many showy resorts. It was near Grand Street and turned out to be very handsomely fitted up. He talked around about investments for fully 3/4 of an hour with the proprietor, who maintained that his health was poor, and that was the reason he wished a partner. Well, now, just how much money would it take to buy a half interest here? Said Hurstwood, who saw $700 as his limit. 3,000, said the man. Hurstwood's jaw fell. Cash, he said. Cash. He tried to put on an air of deliberation, as one who might really buy, but his eyes showed gloom. He wound up by saying he would think it over and came away. The man he had been talking to sensed his condition in a vague way. I don't think he wants to buy, he said to himself. He doesn't talk right. The afternoon was as gray as lead and cold. It was blowing up a disagreeable winter wind. He visited a place far up on the east side near 69th Street, and it was 5 o'clock and growing dim when he reached there. A portly German kept this place. How about this ad of yours? Asked Hurstwood, who rather objected to the looks of the place. Oh, das is all over, said the German. I will not sell now. Oh, is that so? Yes, there is nothing to that. It's all over. Very well, said Hurstwood, turning around. The German paid no more attention to him, and it made him angry. The crazy ass, he said to himself. What does he want to advertise for? Wholly depressed, he started for 13th Street. The flat had only a light in the kitchen where Carrie was working. He struck a match, and lighting the gas, sat down in the dining room without even greeting her. She came to the door and looked in. It's you, is it? She said, and went back. Yes, he said, without even looking up from the evening paper he had bought. Carrie saw things were wrong with him. He was not so handsome when gloomy. The lines at the sides of the eyes were deepened. Naturally dark of skin, gloom made him look slightly sinister. He was quite a disagreeable figure. Carrie set the table and brought in the meal. Dinner's ready, she said, passing him for something. He did not answer, reading on. She came in and sat down at her place, feeling exceedingly wretched. Won't you eat now? She asked. He folded his paper and drew near, silence holding for a time except for the pass-me's. It's been gloomy today, hasn't it? Ventured Carrie after a time. Yes, he said. He only picked at his food. Are you still sure to close up? Said Carrie, venturing to take up the subject which they had discussed often enough. Of course we are, he said, with the slightest modification of sharpness. This retort angered Carrie. She had had a dreary day of it herself. You needn't talk like that, she said. Oh, he exclaimed, pushing back from the table as if to say more but letting it go at that. Then he picked up his paper. Carrie left her seat, containing herself with difficulty. He saw she was hurt. Don't go away, he said, as she started back into the kitchen. Eat your dinner. She passed, not answering. He looked at the paper a few moments and then rose up and put on his coat. I'm going downtown, Carrie, he said, coming out. I'm out of sorts tonight. She did not answer. Don't be angry, he said. It will be all right tomorrow. He looked at her, but she paid no attention to him, working at her dishes. Goodbye, he said finally, and went out. This was the first strong result of the situation between them. But with the nearing of the last day of business, the gloom became almost a permanent thing. Hurstwood could not conceal his feelings about the matter. Carrie could not help wondering where she was drifting. It got so that they talked even less than usual, and yet it was not Hurstwood who felt any objection to Carrie. It was Carrie who shied away from him. This he noticed. It aroused an objection to her becoming indifferent to him. He made the possibility of friendly intercourse almost a giant task, and then noticed with discontent that Carrie added to it by her manner and made it more impossible. At last the final day came. When it actually arrived, Hurstwood, who had got his mind into such a state where a thunderclap and a raging storm would have seemed highly appropriate, was rather relieved to find that it was a plain, ordinary day. The sun shone, the temperature was pleasant. He felt as he came to the breakfast table that it wasn't so terrible after all. Well, he said to Carrie, today's my last day on Earth. Carrie smiled in answer to his humor. Hurstwood glanced over his paper rather gaily. He seemed to have lost a load. I'll go downtown for a little while, he said after breakfast, and then tomorrow I'll spend the whole day looking about. I think I can get something. Now this thing's off my hands. He went out smiling and visited the place. Shaughnessy was there. They had made all arrangements to share according to their interests. When, however, he had been there several hours, gone out 3 more, and returned, his elation had departed. As much as he had objected to the place, now that it was no longer to exist, he felt sorry. He wished that things were different. Shaughnessy was coolly businesslike. Well, he said at 5 o'clock, we might as well count the change and divide. They did so. The fixtures had already been sold and the sum divided. Good night, said Hurstwood at the final moment, in a last effort to be genial. So long, said Shaughnessy, scarcely deigning a notice. Thus the Warren Street arrangement was permanently concluded. Carrie had prepared a good dinner at the flat, but after his ride up, Hurstwood was in a solemn and reflective mood. Well, said Carrie inquisitively. I'm out of that, he answered, taking off his coat. As she looked at him, she wondered what his financial state was now. They ate and talked a little. Will you have enough to buy in anywhere else? Asked Carrie. No, he said. I'll have to get something else and save up. It would be nice if you could get someplace, said Carrie, prompted by anxiety and hope. I guess I will, he said reflectively. For some days thereafter, he put on his overcoat regularly in the morning and sallied forth. On these ventures, he first consoled himself with the thought that with the $700 he could still make some advantageous arrangement. He thought about going to some brewery, which, as he knew, frequently controlled saloons which they leased, and get them to help him. Then he remembered that he would have to pay out several hundred any way for fixtures and that he would have nothing left for his monthly expenses. It was costing him nearly $80 a month to live. No, he said in his sanest moments, I can't do it. I'll get something else and save up. This getting something proposition complicated itself the moment he began to think of what it was he wanted to do. Manage a place? Where should he get such a position? The papers contained no request for managers. Such positions, he knew well enough, were either secured by long years of service or were bought with a half or third interest. Into a place important enough to need such a manager, he had not money enough to buy. Nevertheless, he started out. His clothes were very good and his appearance still excellent, but it involved the trouble of deluding people. People, looking at him, imagined instantly that a man of his age, stout and well-dressed, must be well off. He appeared a comfortable owner of something, a man from whom the common run of mortals could well expect gratuities. Being now 43 years of age and comfortably built, walking was not easy. He had not been used to exercise for many years. His legs tired, his shoulders ached, and his feet pained him at the close of the day, even when he took streetcars in almost every direction. The mere getting up and down, if long continued, produced this result. The fact that people took him to be better off than he was, he well understood. It was so painfully clear to him that it retarded his search. Not that he wished to be less well-appearing, but that he was ashamed to belie his appearance by incongruous appeals. So he hesitated, wondering what to do. He thought of the hotels, but instantly he remembered that he had no experience as a clerk. And what was more important, no acquaintances or friends in that line to whom he could go. He did know some hotel owners in several cities, including New York, but they knew of his dealings with Fitzgerald and Moy. He could not apply to them. He thought of other lines suggested by large buildings or businesses which he knew of, wholesale groceries, hardware, insurance concerns, and the like, but he had had no experience. How to go about getting anything was a bitter thought. Would he have to go personally and ask? Wait outside an office door, and then distinguished and affluent-looking announce that he was looking for something to do? He strained painfully at the thought. No, he could not do that. He really strolled about, thinking, and then, the weather being cold, stepped into a hotel. He knew hotels well enough to know that any decent-looking individual was welcome to a chair in the lobby. This was in the Broadway Central, which was then one of the most important hotels in the city. Taking a chair here was a painful thing to him. To think he should come to this. He had heard loungers about hotels called chair warmers. He had called them that himself in his day. But here he was, despite the possibility of meeting someone who knew him, shielding himself from the cold and the weariness of the streets in a hotel lobby. I can't do this way, he said to himself. There's no use of my starting out mornings without first thinking up some place to go. I'll think of some places and then look them up. It occurred to him that the positions of bartenders were sometimes open, but he put this out of his mind. Bartender. He, the ex-manager. It grew awfully dull sitting in the hotel lobby, and before he went home. He tried to put on a business air as he went in, but it was a feeble imitation. The rocking chair in the dining room was comfortable. He sank into it gladly, with several papers he had bought, and began to read. As she was going through the room to begin preparing dinner, Carrie said, "The man was here for the rent today." "Oh, was he?" said Hurstwood. The least wrinkle crept into his brow as he remembered that this was February the 2nd, the time the man had always called. He fished down in his pocket for his purse, getting the first taste of paying out when nothing is coming in. He looked at the fat green roll as a sick man looks at the one possible saving cure. Then he counted off $28. "Here you are," he said to Carrie when she came through again. He buried himself in his papers and read. Oh, the rest of it. The relief from walking and thinking. What Lethean waters were these, floods of telegraphed intelligence? He forgot his troubles, in part. Here was a handsome young woman, if you might believe the newspaper drawings, suing a rich, fat, candy-making husband in Brooklyn for divorce. Here was another item detailing the wrecking of a vessel in ice and snow off Princess Bay on Staten Island. A long, bright column told of the doings in the theatrical world. The plays produced, the actors appearing, the managers making announcements. Fanny Davenport was just opening at the Fifth Avenue. Daly was producing King Lear. He read of the early departure for the season of a party composed of the Vanderbilts and their friends for Florida. An interesting shooting affray was on in the mountains of Kentucky. So he read, rocking in the warm room near the radiator and waiting for dinner to be served. Chapter 35. The passing of effort, the visage of care. The next morning, he looked over the papers and waded through a long list of advertisements, making a few notes. Then he turned to the Male Help Wanted column, but with disagreeable feelings. The day was before him, a long day in which to discover something, and this was how he must begin to discover. He scanned the long column, which mostly concerned bakers, bushelmen, cooks, compositors, drivers, and the like, finding two things only which arrested his eye. One was a cashier wanted in a wholesale furniture house, and the other a salesman for a whiskey house. He had never thought of the latter. At once he decided to look that up. The firm in question was Aylesbury & Co., whiskey brokers. He was admitted almost at once to the manager on his appearance. "Good morning, sir," said the latter, thinking at first that he was encountering one of his out-of-town customers. "Good morning," said Hurstwood. "You advertised, I believe, for a salesman?" "Oh," said the man, showing plainly the enlightenment which had come to him. Yes, I did." "I thought I'd drop in," said Hurstwood with dignity. "I've had some experience in that line myself." "Oh, have you?" said the man. "What experience have you had?" "Well, I've managed several liquor houses in my time. Recently, I owned a third interest in a saloon at Warren and Hudson Streets." "I see," said the man. Hurstwood ceased, waiting for some suggestion. "We did want a salesman," said the man. "I don't know as it's anything you'd care to take hold of, though." "I see," said Hurstwood. "Well, I'm in no position to choose at present. If it were open, I should be glad to get it." The man did not take kindly at all to his no position to choose. He wanted someone who wasn't thinking of a choice or something better, especially not an old man. He wanted someone young, active, and glad to work actively for a moderate sum. Hurstwood did not please him at all. He had more of an air than his employers. "Well," he said in answer, "we'd be glad to consider your application. We shan't decide for a few days yet. Suppose you send us your references." "I will," said Hurstwood. He nodded good morning and came away. At the corner he looked at the furniture company's address and saw that it was in West 23rd Street. Accordingly, he went up there. The place was not large enough, however. It looked moderate, the men in it idle and small-salaried. He walked by, glancing in, and then decided not to go in there. "They want a girl, probably, at 10 a week," he said. At 1 o'clock he thought of eating, and went to a restaurant in Madison Square. There he pondered over places which he might look up. He was tired. It was blowing up gray again. Across the way through Madison Square Park stood the great hotels looking down upon a busy scene. He decided to go over to the lobby of one and sit a while. It was warm in there and bright. He had seen no one he knew at the Broadway Central. In all likelihood, he would encounter no one here. Finding a seat on one of the red plush divans close to the great windows which look out on Broadway's busy route, he sat musing. His state did not seem so bad in here. Sitting still and looking out, he could take some slight consolation in the few $100s he had in his purse. He could forget, in a measure, the weariness of the street and his tiresome searches. Still, it was only escape from a severe to a less severe state. He was still gloomy and disheartened. There, minutes seemed to go very slowly. An hour was a long, long time in passing. It was filled for him with observations and mental comments concerning the actual guests of the hotel who passed in and out, and those more prosperous pedestrians whose good fortune showed in their clothes and spirits as along Broadway outside. It was nearly the first time since he had arrived in the city that his leisure afforded him ample opportunity to contemplate the spectacle. Now, being perforce idle himself, he wondered at the activity of others. How gay were the youths he saw, how pretty the women. Such fine clothes they all wore. They were so intent upon getting somewhere. He saw coquettish glances cast by magnificent girls. The money it required to train was such, how well he knew. How long it had been since he had had the opportunity to do so. The clock outside registered 4. It was a little early, but he thought he would go back to the flat. This going back to the flat was coupled with the thought that Carrie would think he was sitting around too much if he came home early. He hoped he wouldn't have to, but the day hung heavily on his hands. Over there, he was on his own ground. He could sit in his rocking chair and read. This busy, distracting, suggestive scene was shut out. He could read his papers. Accordingly, he went home. Carrie was reading quite alone. It was rather dark in the flat, shut in as it was. "You'll hurt your eyes," he said when he saw her. After taking off his coat, he felt it incumbent upon him to make some little report of his day. "I've been talking with a wholesale liquor company," he said. "I may go out on the road." "Wouldn't that be nice?" said Carrie. "It wouldn't be such a bad thing," he answered. Always from the man at the corner now, he bought 2 papers, the Evening World and Evening Sun. So now he merely picked his papers up as he came by without stopping. He drew up his chair near the radiator and lighted the gas. Then it was as the evening before. His difficulties vanished in the items he so well loved to read. The next day was even worse than the one before, because now he could not think of where to go. Nothing he saw in the papers he studied till 10 o'clock appealed to him. He felt that he ought to go out, and yet he sickened at the thought. Where to? Where to? "You mustn't forget to leave me my money for this week," said Carrie quietly. They had an arrangement by which he placed $12 a week in her hands, out of which to pay current expenses. He heaved a little sigh as she said this and drew out his purse. Again he felt the dread of the thing. Here he was, taking off, and nothing coming in. "Lord," he said in his own thoughts, "this can't go on." To Carrie he said nothing whatsoever. She could feel that her request disturbed him. To pay her would soon become a distressing thing. Yet what have I got to do with it, she thought. Oh, why should I be made to worry? Hurstwood went out and made for Broadway. He wanted to think up some place. Before long, though, he reached the Grand Hotel at 31st Street. He knew of its comfortable lobby. He was cold after his 20 blocks walk. I'll go in their barber shop and get a shave, he thought. Thus, he justified himself in sitting down in here after his tonsorial treatment. Again, time hanging heavily on his hands, he went home early, and this continued for several days. Each day, the need to hunt paining him, and each day, disgust, depression, shamefacedness driving him into lobby idleness. At last 3 days came in which a storm prevailed, and he did not go out at all. The snow began to fall late one afternoon. It was a regular flurry of large, soft white flakes. In the morning it was still coming down with a high wind, and the papers announced a blizzard. From out the front windows could see a deep, soft bedding. "I guess I'll not try to go out today," he said to Carrie at breakfast. "It's going to be awful bad, so the papers say." "The man hasn't brought my coal either," said Carrie, who ordered by the bushel. "I'll go over and see about it," said Hurstwood. This was the first time he had ever suggested doing an errand, but somehow the wish to sit about the house prompted it as a sort of compensation for the privilege. All day and all night it snowed, and the city began to suffer from a general blockade of traffic. Great attention was given to the details of the storm by the newspapers, which played up the distress of the poor in large type. Hurstwood sat and read by his radiator in the corner. He did not try to think about his need of work. This storm being so terrific and tying up all things robbed him of the need. He made himself wholly comfortable and toasted his feet. Carrie observed his ease with some misgiving. For all the fury of the storm, she doubted his comfort. He took his situation too philosophically. Hurstwood, however, read on and on. He did not pay much attention to Carrie. She fulfilled her household duties and said little to disturb him. The next day it was still snowing, and the next bitter cold. Hurstwood took the alarm of the paper and sat still. Now he volunteered to do a few other little things. One was to go to the butcher, another to the grocery. He really thought nothing of these little services in connection with their true significance. He felt as if he were not wholly useless, indeed, in such a stress of weather, quite worthwhile about the house. On the fourth day, however, it cleared, and he read that the storm was over. Now, however, he idled, thinking how sloppy the streets would be. It was noon before he finally abandoned his papers and got under way. Owing to the slightly warmer temperature, the streets were bad. He went across 14th Street on the car and got a transfer south on Broadway. One little advertisement he had relating to a saloon down in Pearl Street. When he reached the Broadway Central, however, he changed his mind. "What's the use?" he thought, looking out upon the slop and snow. "I couldn't buy into it. It's 1,000 to 1 nothing comes of it. I guess I'll get off." And off he got. In the lobby he took a seat and waited again, wondering what he could do. While he was idly pondering, satisfied to be inside, a well-dressed man passed up the lobby, stopped, looked sharply as if not sure of his memory, and then approached. Hurstwood recognized Cargill, the owner of the large stables in Chicago of the same name, whom he had last seen at Avery Hall the night Carrie appeared there. The remembrance of how this individual brought up his wife to shake hands on that occasion was also on the instant clear. Hurstwood was greatly abashed. His eyes expressed the difficulty he felt. "Why, it's Hurstwood," said Cargill, remembering now and sorry that he had not recognized him quickly enough in the beginning to have avoided this meeting. "Yes," said Hurstwood. "How are you?" "Very well," said Cargill, troubled for something to talk about. "Stopping here?" "No," said Hurstwood, "just keeping an appointment." "I knew you had left Chicago. I was wondering what had become of you." "Oh, I'm here now," answered Hurstwood, anxious to get away. "Doing well, I suppose?" "Excellent." "Glad to hear it." They looked at one another, rather embarrassed. "Well, I have an engagement with a friend upstairs. I'll leave you. So long." Hurstwood nodded his head. Damn it all, he murmured, turning toward the door. I knew that would happen. He walked several blocks up the street. His watch only registered 1:30. He tried to think of some place to go or something to do. The day was so bad, he wanted only to be inside. Finally, his feet began to feel wet and cold, and he boarded a car. This took him to 59th Street, which was as good as anywhere else. Landed here, he turned to walk back along 7th Avenue, but the slush was too much. The misery of lounging about with nowhere to go became intolerable. He felt as if he were catching cold. Stopping at a corner, he waited for a car southbound. This was no day to be out. He would go home. Carrie was surprised to see him at 3:15. It's a miserable day out, was all he said. Then he took off his coat and changed his shoes. That night he felt a cold coming on and took quinine. He was feverish until morning and sat about the next day while Carrie waited on him. He was a helpless creature in sickness, not very handsome in a dull-colored bath gown and his hair uncombed. He looked haggard about the eyes and quite old. Carrie noticed this, and it did not appeal to her. She wanted to be good-natured and sympathetic, but something about the man held her aloof. Toward evening, he looked so badly in the weak light that she suggested he go to bed. You better sleep alone, she said. You'll feel better. I'll open your bed for you now. All right, he said. As she did all these things, she was in a most despondent state. What a life. What a life was her one thought. Once during the day, when he sat near the radiator, hunched up and reading, she passed through and, seeing him, wrinkled her brows. In the front room, where it was not so warm, she sat by the window and cried. This was the life cut out for her, was it? To live cooped up in a small flat with someone who was out of work, idle and indifferent to her? She was merely a servant to him now, nothing more. This crying made her eyes red, and when, in preparing his bed, she lighted the gas and, having prepared it, called him in, he noticed the fact. What's the matter with you? He asked, looking into her face. His voice was hoarse, and his unkempt head only added to its gruesome quality. Nothing, said Carrie weakly. You've been crying, he said. I haven't either, she answered. It was not for love of him that he knew. You needn't cry, getting into bed. Things will come out all right. In a day or two he was up again, but rough weather holding, he stayed in. The Italian newsdealer now delivered the morning papers, and these he read assiduously. A few times after that he ventured out, but meeting another of his old-time friends, he began to feel uneasy sitting about hotel corridors. Every day he came home early, and at last made no pretense of going anywhere. Winter was no time to look for anything. Naturally, being about the house, he noticed the way Carrie did things. She was far from perfect in household methods and economy, and her little deviations on this score first caught his eye. Not, however, before her regular demand for her allowance became a grievous thing. Sitting around as he did, the weeks seemed to pass very quickly. Every Tuesday, Carrie asked for her money. Do you think we live as cheaply as we might? He asked one Tuesday morning. I do the best I can, said Carrie. Nothing was added to this at the moment, but the next day he said, Do you ever go to the Gansport market over here? I didn't know there was such a market, said Carrie. They say you can get things lots cheaper there. Carrie was very indifferent to the suggestion. These were things which she did not like at all. How much do you pay for a pound of meat? He asked one day. Oh, there are different prices, said Carrie. Sirloin steak is 22 cents. That's steep, isn't it? He answered. And so he asked about other things. until finally, with the passing days, it seemed to become a mania with him. He learned the prices and remembered them. His errand-running capacity also improved. It began in a small way, of course. Carrie, going to get her hat one morning, was stopped by him. "Where are you going, Carrie?" he asked. "Over to the baker's," she answered. "I'd just as leave go for you," he said. She acquiesced, and he went. Each afternoon he would go to the corner for the papers. "Is there anything you want?" he would say. By degrees she began to use him. Doing this, however, she lost the weekly payment of $12. "You want to pay me today?" she said one Tuesday about this time. "How much?" he asked. She understood well enough what it meant. "Well, about $5, she answered. "I owe the coal man." The same day he said, "I think this Italian up here on the corner sells coal at 25 cents a bushel. I'll trade with him." Carrie heard this with indifference. "All right," she said. Then it came to be. "George, I must have some coal today, or you must get some meat of some kind for dinner." He would find out what she needed and order. Accompanying this plan came skimpiness. "I only got a half-pound of steak," he said, coming in one afternoon with his papers. "We never seem to eat very much." These miserable details ate the heart out of Carrie. They blackened her days and grieved her soul. Oh, how this man had changed. All day and all day, here he sat reading his papers. The world seemed to have no attraction. Once in a while he would go out in fine weather. It might be 4 or 5 hours, between 11 and 4. She could do nothing but view him with gnawing contempt. It was apathy with Hurstwood, resulting from his inability to see his way out. Each month drew from his small store. Now he had only $500 left, and this he hugged, half feeling as if he could stave off absolute necessity for an indefinite period. Sitting around the house, he decided to wear some old clothes he had, this coming first with the bad days. Only once he apologized in the very beginning. "It's so bad today, I'll just wear these around." Eventually, these became the permanent thing. Also, he had been wont to pay 15 cents for a shave and a tip of 10 cents. In his first distress, he cut down the tip to 5, then to nothing. Later, he tried a 10-cent barber shop, and finding that the shave was satisfactory, patronized regularly. Later still, he put off shaving to every other day, then to every third, and so on, until once a week became the rule. On Saturday, he was a sight to see. Of course, as his own self-respect vanished, it perished for him and Carrie. She could not understand what had gotten into the man. He had some money. He had a decent suit remaining. He was not bad-looking when dressed up. She did not forget her own difficult struggle in Chicago, but she did not forget either that she had never ceased trying. He never tried. He did not even consult the ads in the papers anymore. Finally, a distinct impression escaped from her. "What makes you put so much butter on the steak?" he asked her one evening, standing around in the kitchen. "To make it good, of course," she answered. "Butter is awful dear these days," he suggested. "You wouldn't mind it if you were working," she answered. He shut up after this and went into his paper, but the retort rankled in his mind. It was the first cutting remark that had come from her. That same evening, Carrie, after reading, went off to the front room to bed. This was unusual. When Hurstwood decided to go, he retired as usual without a light. It was then that he discovered Carrie's absence. "That's funny," he said. "She's sitting up." He gave the matter no more thought, but slept. In the morning, she was not beside him. Strange to say, this passed without comment. Night approaching, and a slightly more conversational feeling prevailing, Carrie said, "I think I'll sleep alone tonight. I have a headache." "All right," said Hurstwood. The third night she went to her front bed without apologies. This was a grim blow to Hurstwood, but he never mentioned it. "All right," he said to himself with an irrepressible frown. "Let her sleep alone."